Welcome to Shift, a college admissions ACT, SAT, and CLT podcast for a changing world. I'm Tyler, the founder of Achievable, and we have an affordable ACT course that includes everything you need to ace your ACT. A full textbook, tons of questions backed by our memory-enhancing algorithm, videos on key topics, a built-in study planner, and full-length practice exams. You can get a free trial at achievable.me, and if you like it, use the code podcast, get 10% off. Now, let's get started. Today, we've got Travis Miner from Open Door Education. Travis, I'm really excited to have you on the show and would love if you could just introduce yourself real quick.
Thanks, Tyler. It's great to be here. My name's Travis Miner, and I'm the founder of Open Door Education. We are a small tutoring, test preparation, and organizational coaching firm based just outside of Boston. We're in Acton, Massachusetts, and we work with students both in person here at our office in Acton and also online throughout the country and world. And we have been in business now for a little over 13 years. And our business is split pretty evenly between SAT and ACT tutoring and academic tutoring. But we've worked with thousands of kids through the SAT and ACT process. And relevant to today, we've also helped a lot of parents navigate this process. So I'm excited to talk a little bit more about how to make sure that goes smoothly.
Right, exactly. Well, and that's kind of I was excited to do this episode because I think that first off, I don't think it's been covered yet. And second off, I think it's basically like you're setting the stage for the entire test preparation process for your kid. And, it could make a big difference in whether they begrudgingly do this or excitedly do this, right? I could imagine. So I'm really curious. Yeah, how do you want to start this off? Like, where do you start this when you're having this conversation with parents?
Let's see. I think one of the key considerations is sort of when does the conversation actually start? When should a parent talk with their student about SAT and ACT college admissions testing, and what should that conversation look like? It depends in part on who the student is and what their goals are. If the student is going to be a recruited athlete, they may need to be providing scores on an earlier basis in order to give coaches pre-reads. So that's sort of a different situation, and I think the conversation's accelerated. But for a lot of students, it's the fall of junior year when they take, maybe it's the PSAT or the pre-ACT in school, or just in general, college sort of starts coming over the horizon and they start thinking seriously about, well, what is this going to look like for us? And I think when having that first conversation, it's really important. Like you are breaking fresh ground, and so it's too early to start talking about goals. And maybe it's not that productive to talk about your own SAT or ACT experience or scores. But really to start by asking your student, what have they heard about this process? Have they talked to any of their friends about it? Sort of get a gauge of like, what is their level of awareness? Has it come up in school? To emphasize to them. So, this is going to be something that you're going to need to do between now and when you apply for college. And having the conversation early can tone down the sense of urgency. If you're having this conversation fall of junior year, you've got basically a full calendar year between then and when they actually are submitting scores to schools. So giving yourself enough runway. The first big step for a lot of students outside of taking that PSAT or pre-ACT in school would be to take a diagnostic SAT and ACT to see where are they starting, which test is the right fit for them, and then start putting together a plan. And it's really important that students have agency in this process. It's sort of a big adult decision that they're making. It might be small in the grand scheme of things, but this idea of I'm going to be taking a college admissions test and I'm going to choose which one feels like the better fit for me based on my scores, but also based on my experience, my perspective, my preferences. And so I think it's really important that parents give their kids the leeway to make that decision thoughtfully. Certainly they can make suggestions and ask guiding questions, but it's in order for the SAT or ACT prep process to be successful, I think it's really important that early on, students know that they have a sense of agency and they actually see that in getting to make or finalize this choice themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think that certainly if you can make it their idea, right, like Inception style, that they are the ones that really want to do this, that would definitely lead to them being more motivated. Do you feel like that conversation starts with the conversation around like what schools they want to go to, or like do you feel like these two things are connected, or do you try to not connect them?
I would treat them as separate, and the reason I would treat them as separate is the second that you get schools involved, there's there's implicit expectations. There's a direct relationship between like this student's score and the scores at certain schools. Like it's tough to not
Mhm.
start considering those things. And it is absolutely important to be talking about different schools and making college lists. But I do think the conversation about testing should start separate. This is, regardless of where the student applies to school, it's in their best interest to get the best possible scores that they can. And so I think focusing on how do we make it possible for this student to be successful in their testing process is really a separate conversation. And then once you have some concrete results, both from diagnostics, but also those, like, a student's diagnostic scores are hopefully not the scores they're ultimately sending to colleges. So you get a little further into the process, they've taken some practice tests, you get a better sense of where they might be scoring. Then that can be a natural segue to talking about specific colleges because you actually have a sense of realistic ranges, and then that can evolve into a goal setting process that might be oriented around specific colleges. But I do think when you first start talking about testing, it should be about this is a necessary process and we want you to be as successful as possible, not you're doing this so that you can go to school X, Y, or Z.
Right. Well, I think that's probably for the best because then if you don't get into school X, Y, or Z, right, like it can be very disappointing. Um, but yeah, I mean, I guess then if it's not about schools, how do you kind of get that incepted into their head? How do you make it their idea?
So I think something that I really love about working with students through the testing process, but that also is really, it affects how we think about it, is that like the student, who that student is when they start the test prep process is different from who they are when they finish it. Like there's a lot of maturing that happens between like summer after sophomore year and like fall of senior year. And there are some students that are ready to do the work and are have intrinsic motivation right from the get-go, and that's great. And when we see that, we want to run with it. Maybe they can even finish the process earlier. But also, students are going to become more mature, become more sophisticated, have more academic experience, and also start to feel more invested in the college process as time goes on. So the pattern that I most frequently see, and I think it's a normal and natural one, is that for students who start, say, from fall of junior year through the end of junior year, if they're doing that initial test prep process during the school year, I think they get a lot of value out of it. It's important. It builds a strong foundation. And I think the parents drive the bus a little bit more. A lot of times the parents may be more involved. The the student is doing this in part because they're supposed to and they need to, and that's okay. But over time, as they start touring colleges, like I love it when a student comes back after April or February vacation, they've toured a couple colleges, they found some place they really could see themselves, then the testing process takes on a different tone because now they're not doing it for some nebulous idea of college. They're doing it because, like, I'm doing this because these are places I really see myself and think I would be happy and I want this for myself. So I think the transition is they go from doing it for their parents or for their guidance counselor or for the idea of college in and of itself to shifting to doing it for themselves. And that's where students get to the next level. Like you can make good progress and understand the test and have a strong foundation. And what happens during summer of senior year and into fall of senior year sometimes helps students break through that plateau that they were at because they're doing it for different reasons and that matters.
Well, they can see the outcome maybe.
Yeah, it feels a lot more tangible when you realize, oh my goodness, I'm only going to be a high schooler for 8 more months.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I am curious about that. Like, if you're a parent and you want your kid to take testing seriously, like, is it a strategy to maybe do a couple of college visits like early on? Like maybe not even official ones, just like unofficial, drive down and roll around the campus on your own kind of thing.
I I think it is a fantastic thing to do. And I think a fantastic thing to do from an early age, not in a sense of like, hey, we have these expectations for you, but so a student begins to feel like comfortable and familiar with that environment and can see themselves there, can experience a lot of different, I mean, going on a family trip to a college town, doing some fun stuff, and also driving around campus and checking things out. Great, great little trip to take. And that exposure just sort of eases us into the college process. And I think also can make it a little bit less intimidating when students have sort of early exposure to that type of environment. Um, so I would say across the board, that's a good thing to do as long as it's not coming from the perspective of we expect you to go to Harvard, Yale, or Princeton. And I do hear those stories where folks have like, they did the college tours when they were early, but they specifically did the most well-known Ivy tours. And for most students, I would not recommend that. In my own college process, the most important conversation I had with my parents, and this was when, whether they realized it or not, were sort of handing me the reins. The summer before my senior year, my mom and I got ice cream. And the parking lot, she said, you don't have to go to college. And just
Right.
her, like, essentially giving me that permission in the sense that, like, if I'm doing this, I'm not doing it because she's making me. I'm not doing this for my parents. If I want this, I should want it for myself. And that changed things for me a little. And I think it was really, really important and at the right time. A year ago, I probably wasn't ready to hear that or wouldn't have been able to take that and run with it. But when the student has the maturity to say, yeah, I get to create my own future and this is the future I want for myself. So darn it, I'm going to put in the work.
Right. Well, not only put in the work, but also I think it's like you kind of can see your future a little bit, right?
Yeah.
And frankly, I think, I mean, one of, particularly I know among maybe students that are not trying to go to Harvard or whatever, right? Like there's sometimes just this thought of like, what's the point of the tests, right? Like it doesn't affect my grades. I with test optional now, it's like, oh, well, I don't need test scores, right? So I think a lot of people don't understand kind of the opportunity part of it. And I guess that was maybe the question that I was gonna move to next is kind of, as a parent, should you be positioning this testing experience in a positive light and kind of being like it can unlock opportunities for you, potentially get you like scholarship money or something like that? Or should you be more saying like, this is something you've got to do and here's why? Like, how do you frame it?
Oh, that's a really great question. And maybe it's a cop out. I guess my initial answer would be it depends on the student and what is most motivating to them. But I don't think it's a parent's job or should be their responsibility to sell a student on the idea of testing. I think providing them with accurate information about this is, these are the potential outcomes from taking this test and doing well, that students should know the stakes. Um, I think that's important information for students to have and also treats them as, as having agency in the process. Um,
Hmm.
and, and I think it is also completely reasonable to say, like, this might not be fun. It'd be great if it was fun. We try to make it fun, but it might not be fun. This might just be one of those things in life that it's hard work. And if you do it and if you work hard at it, there will be a positive outcome. And here is what that will likely be. And you don't have to pretend that they are something that they're not. Um,
Hmm.
yeah. And I think some students are even motivated with sort of the idea the SAT is trying to trick them and they're going to battle against the SAT. For some kids, I think that perspective lands or resonates a little bit. And for others, maybe it's less it's less emotional, so to speak.
Right. Yeah, I mean, do you think it changes also depending on kind of what the student's relationship is with school already, right? Like if they're already kind of like, for lack of a better word, like a motivated test taker with their academics, does that kind of, is that easier then? And then what do you do if they're not?
Absolutely. And I think, um, I think tests are a great opportunity for a lot of students to go back and address deficiencies in their understanding of certain concepts. And those deficiencies may not be their fault. Right now, we're working with a lot of students who need help with geometry and going over some like pretty basic geometry concepts because they were learning these in March of 2020 when COVID hit and everything got turned upside down. And so, yeah, this is a gap in their content base, and we're going to go back, address that, because they're also going to see it on the test and it will be helpful for them beyond that. So I think there's that great opportunity to address challenges, and that those challenges, it can actually be really reaffirming for a student that this thing they felt like they didn't know or understood, or they told themselves like, I'm bad at geometry. No, maybe you just weren't in a position to be successful. When you come back to it, it actually makes a whole lot of sense. So I think, the way that like the parent's role in that is we don't want to we don't want to sugarcoat things. If a student has a track record of having a really tough time in math, we should name and acknowledge that going into the process and be prepared to address it. But also we want to be conscious of how we actually talk about it. And I think being conscious of things that are like permanent or pervasive. And what I mean by that is like
Mm.
if we say that like Tina is bad at tests, or Tina is bad at math, like that's like a quality that Tina has. That isn't, it's not a thing that happened. It's a part of like who she is, and it sounds like a fixed value. Like this is just who she is. However, if it's like in the past, this student has had difficulty with these particular content areas, like the more that we can make it, we can frame it around what has happened in the past. Um, and that may be a temporary condition. In the past, this student has had difficulty with triangles. That doesn't mean that's part of who they are and this will always be true. So when I hear parents say during like an initial meeting, like this student like isn't good at this, or, and I think this is happens for a lot of parents, I'm a bad test taker or I'm really bad at math. And so by like some transitive property, this also applies to my student. And if it comes from a good place, like they want to make their kid feel okay about the fact that maybe this isn't their strength. But really, I think it's sort of, it presents indirectly a limiting belief, but it's tough for the student not to read through that and be like, so I'm bad at this and I'll always be bad at this, and this isn't something I can change. So I think any language that when we talk about testing, test results, student strengths, as well as their challenges, we want to frame things as temporary and objective, and leave space for them to change.
Yeah, well, I think certainly not taking your personal experience and projecting it, especially, I mean, probably even if it's positive, but also especially if it was negative, right? But yeah, I think it's more like, I don't know, this is going to sound so corny, but it's like the test taking journey, your child should be able to kind of find themselves or find their own path through it and have their own experience with it. It doesn't have to be your experience. And, it could be one where maybe they actually like do really well. Maybe they actually really enjoy it. Like you don't like just why would you why would you limit them or make them think that that's not possible before they even start?
Yeah, it's my some of my favorite experiences that I've had with students over the years have been those situations where a test actually helped the student to see that they were good at something that they didn't think they were good at. And it's it's pretty cool to see.
Yeah, I agree. But yeah, I mean, I think when we're thinking about like how sort of to talk to your kids about this, maybe now, I mean, I feel like we've covered kind of the emotional side of it a fair amount. And so maybe now we can switch more to kind of like the brass tacks part. So thinking about like how do you talk to them about basically like what the time commitment is going to be, like how it's going to have to fit into their schedule, Like things like that. Like how do you kind of gently tell them that, hey, by the way, you have a bunch of extra work to do now?
Yeah. So I think it again depends on the student, use your intuition. I think for some students it really is important to be um uh that it's saying like these are my expectations. And for a student who's like a rising junior in high school and their like maybe level of maturity or autonomy, I think it's completely appropriate to say this is something that's important for you to do, and our expectations. And note, our expectations aren't that you will get a 1400 or a 34. Our expectations are that you will do the work. Our expectations is that you will do your best. Our expectation is that when you're having difficulty or when you aren't able to put in the time, you'll communicate about it. And like if you do those things, we're on the right track. I think also in terms of like at the end of the day, for when it comes to testing, like there's a number. There's a number you can put on the whole thing. This is the best score that the student got. I think that goal setting is a really important part of it. And I don't know how many opportunities this student may have had up to this point to say, like, I'm based on my own experience, based on my starting scores, based on what I know about myself, this is the goal that I'm going to set for myself. I think the SAT is an awesome opportunity to do that. And I would encourage parents to give their students the space to set their own goals. And sometimes they're going to be unrealistic. A student might have a score goal that's 400 points above their starting score, and you say that's probably not going to happen. And I think rather than shutting that down, like if the student wants to aim big, like we don't want to throw a wet towel on that, but there's ways also that we can um, sort of approach that in a way that's constructive, of saying like that's an awesome goal. I don't like for your first test that might be a little bit far, but it's a good thing to aim for. What do you want to shoot for like this first practice test and those incremental goals,
Mhm.
but not setting the goal for the student? Like they're the ones taking the test. Let them be the one to set the goal. You can give suggestions and encouragement, but I think that's also a really important piece of the student taking over the process. So it's fair to say these are our
Mhm.
expectations, but when it comes to what are the like numerical outcomes or what are the goals around numerical outcomes, the student should absolutely have ownership over that.
For sure. I mean, what do you think about the idea of, for instance, basically saying, okay, I understand you want to get a 1550, right? Here's what it would take, right? Like in basically like laying out like how many hours it's going to be and like what their schedule would need to look like. Do you think that's a constructive thing to do, or it's a little bit kind of like, you know, I don't know how to say this, like cruel, like because you're kind of t showing them how hard it is to reach that goal, or
I think it depends. I think it depends on the intention, and rather than because the reality is, until I spend some time with a student, I don't really know what it would take for them to get a 1550. And we could say like it'll be this enormous amount of work and all these practice tests and stuff, and that's I don't think unreasonable to approximate. I would rather though have an incremental goal, have a student hit their first incremental goal. Like, okay, so you saw how much work it took to get 100 points in total.
Mhm.
What do you like? What do you think? Like, is 1550 still a reasonable goal, or what do you think it would take to get there? And then, if that conversation, instead of it being this abstraction, or you're telling them this is what's going to take you, if they have some lived experience with this test and how much work it took to make progress, and then you can frame the conversation on based on your experience, what's a reasonable expectation? I think that can be really, really helpful. And again, I mean, as with like in any sort of negotiation or tricky conversation, when you can take it out of the abstract and have like objective information that we can talk about, but like we're on the same team talking
Mhm.
about this situation, I think
Right.
that's a really constructive way to approach it.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I think, like, in particular, I mean, maybe we even can shift this to like things not to do, right? I would say one of the first things you should not do is be like, you didn't get a 100 point increase. Well, like, you failed, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's, in terms of things that parents should know going into the testing process, scores will rise and fall. Like progress is not linear. And sometimes a student will take 2 steps forward and 1 back. Sometimes they'll take 1 forward and 2 back. And it really, it's about the war, not the battles. So I think it's important when there's progress, we should celebrate that. Absolutely. And when a student doesn't get the results that they hope for, all right, give them a little bit of space to like process that and work through it. And then it's really about how do we better understand this? Again, turning to like, we have objective information about it. What does it tell us and what should we do about it? As opposed to, you failed, you didn't achieve this goal. I don't think that's going to be constructive for the parent or the student, and probably not going to be particularly helpful for their relationship.
Right. Well, and in particular, again, like the best way to have your child get a great score is to have your child be intrinsically motivated, right? So if you suddenly put yourself on the side of the tests and you're looking for test scores and you're upset when their test scores are not good enough, now you're basically putting yourself like against them in the way that the test is against them. And that might be very demotivating to them, especially if you've been, giving them a hard time about their academics otherwise.
Yeah, that's a really important point. And parents and students should feel like they're on the same team. And so when it comes to the testing piece, and for a student that is like, they are academically and emotionally mature enough to put in the work, they're feeling motivated, the parent's role is really do whatever you can to create an infrastructure that makes it easy for them to be successful, celebrate their successes, and get out of the way. That
Hmm.
I think it's a transition that happens, and oftentimes it happens sort of like end of junior year into summer and fall senior year.
Hmm.
But one of the best things parents can do is make it easy for their students to have a like quiet, undisturbed time and place where they can do their work. Check in to see if there's anything the student needs, and if the student's doing the work, let them run with it.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, I think that's great advice. And maybe now it's kind of like maybe we could shift even in that direction a little bit and talk about, not just talking about prep before it starts, but like as it's going on, right? Like how do you kind of, let's say your kid takes a practice test and they get a kind of a bad score and they're feeling bad about it, right? Like how do you kind of keep them motivated?
Hmm. I think I'd say firstly, if the student is working with a tutor or is taking a class, then I think the parent's job in that situation is less trying to like motivate the student and more um being being supportive to the student. And if they're disappointed, letting them be disappointed, acknowledge the fact that they're disappointed. You don't need to tell them like, no, this isn't, like, you shouldn't feel that way. And to emphasize the idea of like this, if you have a bad score on a practice test, you're not done. This is like, we're still in the game. Everybody has bad days. Um, and to really turn it back to, well, what can we learn from this? And so questions that I like to ask students after tests, I think, can be constructive for parents as well. Is it like, was there anything that surprised you? What did you notice? Were there any sections that you felt went really well? Also asking, uh, are there things they did for this test that they thought like they want to make sure they do in the future? Or are there things like, if they could rewind to this morning, what would you do differently? And I think some of these open-ended questions that don't convey any sense of judgment ask the student to reflect on the experience a little bit, but also aren't overemphasizing the results. I think those can be useful questions. And throughout the process, a student's like, how's the SAT studying going? And maybe you get a like, fine. And maybe there's another layer of question there about like, are there any things that you feel like you've learned so far that have been really helpful? Or again, what surprised you? Are there certain things that feel like they're getting easier? But again, questions that encourage the student to be reflective about their own process, because also when they do that and when they answer that question, like, I think sometimes that sort of starts something going in their thought process that can have a really positive long-term impact when we are encouraging them to think about what happened, what do I want to repeat, what do I want to change.
Hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I guess maybe that's kind of the lesson that ties all this together is you're kind of teaching your child how to deal with, you know, going through a difficult process that requires multiple months and also multiple like shots at the test and being like dealing with disappointment, right? Or dealing with, something being harder than you thought it was. Like it's all part of that lovely growth experience.
Yeah. And that's where I think it's really important to not blow test results out of proportion. Like, sometimes it happens that a student has been getting ready and they bomb a test for whatever reason. Maybe it was their fault. Maybe there were some circumstances beyond their control. But I think to treat that as like a cataclysmic event is really a mistake, as opposed to like, hey, it's not such a big deal. I mean, we think about when a really small child falls over and immediately looks at people's faces. If everyone looks horrified, then they start crying and this was a negative experience. Um,
Right.
but but if people are like, yeah, like, you're okay, get back up. It's frankly, it's kind of the same thing with testing. Like, sometimes you fall over, you're not gonna have a good day every day. And if the attitude is it's not a big deal, get back in there, I think that's a really healthy approach for it that hopefully carries on to more than just the SAT or ACT.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Do you have anything else that you wanted to cover on this topic today?
Um, let's see. Um, I think the last thing I would just want to acknowledge is that students are at really different places developmentally at this age, and sometimes students need time, and there is really no substitute for it. And I have seen situations where they wanted to get testing done early, and they started fall of junior year, and the student just wasn't ready for whatever reason, whether it's academically
Hmm.
ready, socially and emotionally ready. And then and rather than force it, this was the really important piece. Rather than force it, the parent said, you know what? This isn't working right now. Let's take a break and come back to it. And I like to think the student had some agency in making that decision too, saying like, I know this is a thing I need to do, but now isn't the time. And then maybe they come back a couple months later and they're ready to do the work. And I don't think there's anything that people could have done to have made them ready sooner. Sometimes you just need to step away, take a breath, give them some time, and come back to it. Um, and
Hmm.
and have faith in your kids. I think that's the other really important piece. Know your kids, support your kids, have expectations, but also trust them.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, it's like I think that parents get used to kind of making decisions for their kids. And then, this is right around the same time in their life where they kind of need to start making their own decisions and dealing with their own consequences of those decisions a little bit, right? And certainly, obviously, as a parent, you don't want to just be like, all right, well, you're totally autonomous now and good luck with this. And then they don't do well and don't go to the colleges that they want to go to. And right, like you can see the consequences much more clearly than them because like you're looking at it in hindsight. Um, but certainly, I think when it comes to like how the student is feeling, right, and also even like things about the testing process, like, I think part of the exercise for you as the parent is probably giving up uh, some of that direct control of the situation.
Absolutely. Which is not easy. This is like the students are doing hard work. The parents are doing hard work here too, and it's delicate and people will make mistakes and overstep or maybe not intervene when they should. Like, this is part of the process. But if at the core, the student and parent are truly on the same team and treating one another as though they're on the same team, I think that's the most foundational ingredient for success.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, great. Thank you so much. This has been Shift, a college admissions podcast for a changing world. hosted by Tyler from Achievable with Travis Miner from Open Door Education. And you can get a free trial of Achievable's ACT course by going to achievable.me and use the code podcast to save 10% if you're interested.